today's session then, proper. This is the actual session on Act 4, the first 4 scenes. They are so short, we do not need longer on them. The key points will be identified throughout, obviously. The fourth one is the strongest as such, if that makes any sense, in terms of the one that has the most content probably for us. Maybe the third. They're both good. And we're going to mostly be having a look at, realistically, the stuff to do with Hamlet's relationship with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Hamlet's relationship with his mother, and Claudius developing more as the kind of archetypal villain figure. He's kind of really coming out at this point to being more kind of brutal in his behavior, like he's becoming more sinister in this scene, and he gets his second kind of soliloquy. It's quite a short one, but he gets a second soliloquy. So, as I said, this week's task, some of you have already sent it over to me, which is absolutely fantastic, but was to read and annotate Act 4, Scenes 1 to 4, do a close reading of the last soliloquy. That's our last soliloquy close reading today, and then to find 3 critical quotes on minor characters by the end of the week, and put that in the Teams page rather than the Teams chat. Okay, so that everybody can access them. So that is today's kind of, this week's, content that some of you have already sent over to me. So I'm delighted to see that already, which is fantastic. So let's get cracking with Act 4, Scene 1. So this comes straight off the back of Hamlet's interaction with his mother in Act 3, Scene 4. And you can, see here, literally, it follows on almost. And sometimes in versions, this will follow without a scene break. Scene breaks are artificial anyway. We should probably all be aware of that. And act breaks especially as well, to an extent. There have been versions where this has followed on from 3-4 directly. Or at least immediately. Obviously can't follow on directly because his characters are on stage, but they comes in immediately. So the king comes in to see his wife, who is upset. What is it in these sighs? He's profound. He's that you must translate. 'Tis fit we understand them. Where is your son? So we come in immediately then to see the king kind of concerned about Gertrude's state. We know that he is aware of the plan that Polonius had to go and spy on Hamlet and her meeting. What he's not aware of at this point, obviously, is that Hamlet has killed Polonius. So we have, what have I seen tonight? An ambiguous line, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern leave because the queen asks them to. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern just hanging around the king now as well, which is quite interesting. So she then ultimately reveals, that Hamlet, she says, is mad. Now, if you remember from the last time, in this scene, Act 3, Scene 4, Hamlet admits to his mother that he isn't mad. So Gertrude's argument here that Hamlet is mad still, that she's like, he's as mad as the sea and wind when both contend. She is maintaining Hamlet's fiction for him, which gives us a really good idea, perhaps, as to Hamlet's, his mother's loyalty in the play, right? Is she supporting him or the king? Is a question I think has come up in many critics and producers, actors, whatever, as minds. But here it's kind of made firmly clear, at least to an extent, that she is at least willing to go along with some of Hamlet's kind of scheming, because she doesn't betray him to the king. So she says, in his lawless fit, so she really emphasizes the madness behind the arras, hearing something stir, whips out his rapier, cries, a rat, and in this brainish apprehension kills the unseen good old man. So this is Polonius' death kind of went through. Now, the king is like, oh no, this is bad, basically. And his liberty is full of threats to us all, to you, yourself, to us, that's himself, to everyone. Alas, how shall this bloody deed be answered? It shall be laid to whose providence should have kept short restraint and out of haunt this mad young man. So the king's like, he's a danger to us all. We need to do something about him, which obviously he has already set up, because we know already that Hamlet is to be sent to England, and Hamlet knows already that he is to be sent to England with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So the king clearly has something in mind, and he's like, he's a danger to us. Now this is perhaps double-meaninged, obviously, in the sense that the king knows that Hamlet perhaps now is a danger to him, having watched the mousetrap and seen all that kind of stuff go down. So he's like, oh, I blame myself. We don't know, what happens. We didn't know what to do. But they keep describing Hamlet here as a foul disease to keep it from divulging. So Hamlet's presence in Denmark is now being referred to as the disease. Previously, Hamlet referred to the corruption of the state as well. Something. And we've also had Marcellus's line: "There's something rotten in the state of Denmark." Here, Hamlet becomes the disease. A madness becomes the disease. Things. So over here, the Queen says, where has Hamlet gone? He's like, well, he's gone to take the body away, and she still kind of re-emphasizes his madness. And the King is like, this is fine, we'll sort it out. We will ship him hence off to England, and this vile deed we must with all our majesty and skill both countenance and excuse. So he's like, this is a big political PR problem for us. We are going to have to do some public facing work to get this sorted realistically. Yeah. So he calls Guildenstern and Rosencrantz back in again, and he asks them to go and find Hamlet. He's like, yep, just go and get him. He's gone off somewhere, maybe into the chapel, as it says here. And then they go, and says, come Gertrude, we'll call up our wisest friends and let them know both what we mean to do and what's untimely done. There's a missing line here, we're not quite sure what it is, don't worry about that too much. Whose whisper over the world's diameter, as level as the cannon to his blank, transports his poisoned shot, may miss our name and hit the woundless air. So basically he's saying here, realistically, we need to get all of our political advisors around so that we can sort this out, this problem, as we may well be. We need to get this cannonball of a shot that Hamlet had done, i.e. the killing of Polonius. It needs to miss them. They need to not be held accountable for this action. Yeah, so they're trying to essentially the king here is managing his political situation. Now, obviously, guys, if you want, to make quite an obvious link here, this is realistically some Machiavellian stuff, right? So he's aware of the kind of public image issue, and he's aware in his position of power that he needs to be kind of taking actions here to kind of do something about this. It's a pretty obvious point, I suppose, but it's worth making at this stage. There we go. So that's Act 4, Scene 1. It's really short. That's all it is. It's a nice little scene if you want to look at some kind of something about the relationship. Probably the only scene actually in the play where we have... no, there's another one later on, but it's really the only scene where we get a properly kind of intimate relationship between the king and the queen. So it's a good one to have in terms of just a little bit on that relationship there, in case you get something on those two characters. It's also obviously good to see the queen's relationship with Hamlet in terms of her lying for him, and it's also good to see Rosencrantz and Guildenstern being the kind of sycophants. Well, not sycophants at this point. They're just being the kind of dog bodies of the king. So, moving on to Act 4, Scene 2. Hamlet starts it. There's a nice little line where Hamlet starts the scene just kind of talking to himself about his stowing away or hiding or securing or whatever you want to call it of Polonius's body. So we have the safely stowed line, but soft what noise, who calls on Hamlet? Oh, here they come. So he is kind of basically setting the scene for us for Act 4, Scene 2, distancing us from 4-1. Hamlet has he stowed the body away, and he hears someone coming. We know who that is. We know it's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And they come in straight off the bat, no kind of like messing around. What have you done, my lord, with the dead body? Yeah. Now, Hamlet's relationship with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, we saw it get a bit frayed in Act 3, Scene 2, when following the kind of recorders section, if we all remember that. And here it's kind of essentially just drifted fully down to a kind of almost a kind of antagonism at this point, realistically. Now, there are some interesting stuff on this. I want to have a quick look point to you towards. I'm not going to go through it much today, actually, at all, but I've put some really good extracts from this essay called Friendship in Hamlet by Robert C. Evans on your document today that you have. So please go through that when you have the time. It really actually gives you an interesting overview, and it gives you an overview of many of the relationships. It goes through the guards, it goes through Horatio as well, but it's nice to see this kind of discussion of Hamlet's friendship with the two characters here. Yeah, it gives you a really nice indication as to how they work, and we're going to keep this question in mind for the next section. Does Hamlet's treatment of Polonius's body and whoops, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern dehumanize him and turn him into the villain he's trying to kill. So this is an interesting thing to consider. The dehumanizing effects of revenge, which we're going to explore next week as well with Laertes, and we already have with the Pyrrhus quote from the Aeneid. It's something that's going to come back again and again towards the end of the play. But it's really good to look at this. There's a really nice point as well about the link between friendship and fortune, and how Hamlet starts talking about friendship as a kind of as an interlinking factor with the prosperity of an individual. Hamlet himself seemingly kind of alone and isolating himself. Also a good point here as well that suggests, as it says here, who's very pairing together. The fact that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are a pair helps emphasize Hamlet's isolation in the play. A nice, really easy point there to make. So back to this. Hamlet just basically refuses to play ball. He won't give them the body, so they can't take it to the chapel as the king's request, and Hamlet knows this is the king's request because that's where dead bodies go. So they, he's just like, I'm just not going to do it. He's like, yep, I'm just... he just rejects them basically. I cannot keep your counsel and you can keep mine. Besides, to be demanded of a sponge, what replication should be made by the son of a king? So Hamlet here refers to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as a sponge. Sponges obviously do two things. They soak up water, and then when they are squeezed, they expel water. So Hamlet's likening of these two characters to a sponge essentially is going to be an extended metaphor that we're going to go through over the course of this interaction with them, but he kind of belittles them and he reaffirms his status. Now, this is something that Hamlet doesn't seem to want to do that often in the play. When he first interacts with Horatio, he rejects the notion of Horatio addressing him as his lord or somebody above him, although that's social convention. Hamlet sees it as kind of inappropriate. They're good friends. He doesn't want to be seen as a different level here. But even though Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are his friends, here he reaffirms himself as the son of a king, and he repositions them down as a sponge. Now, Rosencrantz obviously is slightly uncertain about being called a sponge, as you probably would be had you just been called a sponge yourself. So Hamlet goes into some detail on his metaphor. He says, I, sir, that soaks up the king's countenance, his rewards, his authorities, but such officers do the king best service in the end. So the countenance here, we kind of mean like his, basically his patronage, his kind of support. They as political figures for the king are gaining favour and status and power in the court with him. But because they are a sponge, here's the problem. They're soaking it all up like the sponge. Soaks up water, soaks up water, soaks up water, and water in this case is power and position and status. What he then does is essentially, once he's done with them, once he no longer needs to use them, once the king has got what he wants out of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, he can just, squeeze the sponge, and then there is no more position and power and status for them. Yeah, he says he keeps them like an ape in the corner of his jaw, first mouth to be last swallowed. He basically kind of keeps you hanging around, and then once he's done with you, he gets rid. Okay, so this is a really, really, really useful commentary from Shakespeare himself on the nature of like sycophancy, politics, the court, courtiers in general, and the general kind of status, again, of the kind of upper classes in the kind of Jacobean/Elizabethan courts at the time. So again, power, a key kind of thing here, as well as perhaps a sense of distrust, like Hamlet has an innate cynicism here about the king's intentions with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Okay. And as I said, you can have a look at that AO5 that I mentioned a minute ago, the Robert C. Evans, if you want to explore this in a bit more detail. Okay. So that's a really nice metaphor. It's a really good one to have. And Rosencrantz just kind of basically passes it off. I understand you not, my lord. Whether he doesn't actually understand it, or whether he's just kind of getting rid of this, it's hard to tell. But Hamlet says, basically, look, I'm glad of it. Yeah, he's like, a knavish speech sleeps in a foolish ear, which is a nice kind of line. So you have this idea that Hamlet's kind of like clever, wicked, evil, manipulative speeches just aren't going to go down with Rosencrantz. He's calling him an idiot, basically. So Rosencrantz is like, come on, just tell us where the body is and we'll go to the king. and Hamlet just gives us this absolutely nonsense line. It's presented as a kind of almost like a paradox, I suppose, or like a riddle. Let's see. Yeah, I'll spell that for you here just very quickly. So yeah, it's presented definitely as a kind of as a paradox. Yeah, slash riddle format. But yeah, it has no real kind of outcome ultimately. By paradox and a riddle, just to be clear, what I mean is a paradox is essentially a kind of statement that cannot be solved. There's no actual logical conclusion to it. So it's presented in riddle format. The body to the king. The king is not the body. The king is a thing. And there's no solution to this. It's just nonsense. Okay, Hamlet is just messing around with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern because he can, because he's intelligent, because he has fun doing it. Okay. Now this brings me back to, as I said, that question to think about earlier is Hamlet just being too cruel at this point in the play? He's already kind of dumped Polonius' body somewhere at the castle. He's now messing around with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who want to know where that body is. Is this heroic behaviour? If we look at that, we looked at that Johnson quote previously when we looked at how Johnson finds Hamlet's desire to punish Claudius quite uncomfortable. Does this make him worse? Hard to tell. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern aren't good people, but Hamlet is not being a good person either. Now, the next scene then, so we're already through the first two scenes of this section. It really isn't a long section of text. The next two scenes are a little bit longer and more complex, though. We open with an interesting section. I think this is the only time we see the king in his full political position here. He enters the scene with, and it says 2 or 3. Now, what this means is quite, obviously unclear. It's down to obviously directors, but realistically, it's like 2 or 3 kind of senior political figures, most likely. Yeah, probably some kind of councillors, maybe even characters that you'll see later, like Osric might be one of these. It's not 100% sure, but they are essentially people who are probably in the positions of power that he mentioned in 4:1. Okay, so these are probably those characters. This is an interesting scene that we get to see the king working as the political figure that he is. And we get to see him interacting with others. Think back in terms of this scene, think back to the scenes in Act 3 of The Duchess of Malfi, where we see the courtier figures surrounding the two brothers, Castruccio, etc. And we see all them interacting around Pescara. You get the idea. And we get to see their kind of like scheming and politicking and stuff. And this is the closest we get to that in Hamlet. So the king basically outlines the plan. He says, I've sent to seek him and to find the body. How dangerous it is this man goes loose. We must not yet must we not put the strong law on him. He's loved of the distracted multitude, who like not in their judgment but their eyes. So this is a really interesting point in terms of setting up the kind of political dynamics of Denmark. The king is open that he cannot put the strong law, i.e. he can't execute Hamlet or he can't put anything more severe than Hamlet, because he's loved by the people. He's loved of the distracted multitude. Now, Claudius's contempt for the people of Denmark, perhaps again suggesting these kind of themes of power, and perhaps again cynicism about the nature of monarchy, about the nature of things, or perhaps at least villainous ones anyway, because he certainly seems to not give, doesn't care about, doesn't give a second thought to the kind of the populace. He refers to them as a distracted multitude, i.e. kind of almost idiotic, perhaps the dumb audience that Hamlet himself refers to earlier when he's talking about, the actual comments at the start of Act 3, Scene 1. We almost have here a sense that this is kind of building a dislikable figure in the king. And they says they use their eyes rather than their brains to choose their leaders. As says, and where 'tis so, the offender's scourge is weighed, but never the offence. So they're saying, look, they would judge the punishment more than they would judge the actual crimes. So the king's like, look, to make this smooth, we are just sending him away. Must seem as something deliberate and something that we are just doing to take something serious. Again, the king uses the disease metaphor to describe Hamlet. Hamlet is fundamentally seen by the king as a kind of virus almost infecting the city of the city, the state of Denmark, the castle of Elsinore. So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern turn up. They appear, and the king turns to them and says, hey guys, what's going on? And Rosencrantz just is like kind of completely frustrated. He's like, we just can't understand where the body of Polonius is. I just don't get it. Obviously, guys, that's just as a reminder, at any point, if you have any questions about any of this, please do just send them over to me. I will answer them when I get them. The king is just like, but where is Hamlet? And Rosencrantz is like, well, he's outside. He's off stage a little bit at the moment. He'll find out what you want in a second. And the king asks for him to be brought in. They bring in Hamlet. That's fine. Hamlet comes in with some attendants. Now, often in this, he's bound or like handcuffed or tied up, depending on the time period that he's in. I think the tenant one, he's strapped to a wheelie chair, as far as I remember. So they come in, and the king tries the same approach to speaking to Hamlet that he uses at the start of the play. It's very much a mirroring of that kind of very polite political style that he uses throughout the opening scenes, especially in Act 1, Scene 2, when he's trying to present himself as the loving father of Hamlet. Hamlet at this point does not care. He's killed a man, and he seems to be descending further and further into instability and kind of aggressiveness, so to speak. So Hamlet is asked where Polonius is. Hamlet replies, at supper. The king is like, okay, at supper where? And Hamlet's response is not where he eats, but where he is eaten. So we have this kind of sense of that Hamlet is kind of, again, playing with words. It's a very similar dynamic to that opening scene, but this time it's much more openly hostile than that scene was. There's a certain convocation of politic worms are eaten at him. Your worm is your only emperor for diet. So the politic worms, perhaps an allusion to the diet of worms, which we talked about previously. But most importantly, this is a link back to the previous essay I'd given you on the relationship between human bodies and the political systems in the time period. I think I gave that last lesson. Check your notes from that. And it's this idea that the king's body, like it was described last time by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, as being a kind of larger body that things feed off. The politic worms have become those figures again here. We fat all creatures else to fat us, and we fat ourselves for maggots. So Hamlet is starting to kind of bring this almost kind of slightly nihilistic, certainly kind of universalizing nature of death here. We all eat for ourselves, and yet all we do is make ourselves better food for maggots and worms when we die. Yeah, and everyone will do this the same. He says, your fat king and your lean beggar is but variable service, 2 dishes but to 1 table. That's the end. So he's essentially going, look, death makes us all the same. Your fat here is kind of essentially used as a kind of sign. Your rich and well powered and decorated king is the same as your skinny dying beggar. Yeah, because when they both die, they are the same value to worms. They'll eat them either way. And the king just seems to be just like, I just don't know what's going on. He's like, ugh, yeah, I can't be really dealing with this. He says, alas, alas. And then Hamlet keeps on going, and it gets a little bit more critique-esque, I suppose, around the king. So man may fish with the worm that hath eat of a king, and eat of the fish that hath fed off that worm. So he goes back into this kind of, again, almost kind of like proverby, riddle-esque style. And the king is just not playing with it in the same way that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern does. He says, what dost thou mean by this? He's still using thou, the more kind of personal one here. He doesn't use you, unlike Hamlet, who does. So Claudius is still trying that sense of like the loving father, even if obviously Hamlet here is kind of testing his patience. And Hamlet makes a kind of almost barefaced kind of threat to the king. He says, nothing but to show you how a king may go progress through the guts of a beggar. So he's kind of directly references the kind of death of a king here, and specifically the way in which death will remove the status of the king himself. The king refuses to answer this. He completely changes the topic of the conversation. The king leads this conversation to an extent, although Hamlet's clearly playing with him. And he goes back to the Polonius questions. And Hamlet continues to be difficult. He refers to heaven. He says, "In heaven, send thither to see. If your messenger find him not there, seek him in the other place yourself." Essentially, there, Hamlet saying, Polonius is in heaven. Send someone to find him there. If they don't find him there, then you can go and look for him in the other place yourself. Now, it doesn't probably take a huge amount of biblical knowledge to make the jump here that when he says the other place, he's referring to hell. Hamlet is essentially directly accusing and kind of telling the king he's going to hell here, which is quite a bold move when you are essentially, being held captive, having just murdered somebody in the state. And he says, "But if indeed you find him not within this month, you shall nose him as you go up the stairs into the lobby." So Hamlet finally kind of gives up Polonius's location, telling him that you'll be able to smell him within a month up the stairs if you don't find him soon. So there you go. So the king immediately commands his attendants, his kind of guards or whatever it is they are, however they're represented in the scene. It really is quite uncertain, to go and find him. Hamlet's like, don't worry, you don't have to do it immediately. He's not going anywhere. He will stay till you come. So Hamlet clearly having fun with the king here. And as a reminder, this is Polonius's dead body. Coincidentally, Polonius, the father of his girlfriend, who he has murdered and left upstairs, and he's like, "Yep, he is a dead man. I don't care." Hamlet seems to be so far away at this point from the kind of thoughtful, introverted, quiet, I suppose, and kind of sad and melancholic prince at the start of the play. So the king is still pushing his "I'm your lovely father" angle. It says, "Hamlet, this deed for thine especial safety, which we do tender as we dearly grieve for that which thou hast done, must send thee hence." He's like, "Oh, I'm really sorry, and we really grieve for the things that you have done, but you have to go. Therefore, prepare thyself. The bark is ready, the boat, the embarkment, and the wind at help. The associates tend, and everything is bent for England." So he's like, everything's ready for you to go to England. And Hamlet is like, "Oh, for England?" He knows this. Hamlet already knows that he's going to England, but he asks it again, and then he, goes through the things. "Good." The king says, "So is it, if thou knewest our purposes." Now, we will find out very shortly what the king's purposes are. Openly, he's saying that his purposes are for Hamlet to recover his wits or recover his mental state. What his actual purposes are, as we all know, hopefully by this point, is that his plan is for Hamlet to get executed in England. So Hamlet kind of plays around with kind of the king's purposes. He says, "I see a cherub that sees him," but he goes, which potentially is a linking maybe to his father or something, watching kind of Claudius's kind of thoughts and kind of desires. And Hamlet gets in a last dig before he goes, "But come for England, farewell, dear mother." And he refers to the king as his mother. We could go back to, if we want to, some Freudian readings here if we want to. Hamlet blurring the line between his father and his father and his mother. And the king corrects him. And Hamlet's like, no. In marriage, mother, father and mother is man and wife are one flesh. So therefore, you are my mother. Hamlet constantly in this scene is confrontational, isn't it? It's a scene of confrontation between Hamlet and the king. They are in direct and oppositional status here. The king constantly suggesting things that are not being done by Hamlet. So, the king essentially asks them to follow him, realistically, make sure he gets onto the boat quickly. "I'll get him away tonight." He's like, "I want this done. I want this sorted out." Yeah. Away, for everything is sealed and done. That else leans on this affair. Pray you make haste. So he wants Hamlet out of the country early so that he can start making reparations for the damage that he's done by killing Polonius. The king's got a lot to sort out here. It's a busy time for him. Now, we now have essentially something of a how to describe it, I suppose. It is essentially a soliloquy. I've got an interesting article which I will send to you later and make available for you on the nature of soliloquies in this play, given that we're coming up to our last couple now. But it's an interesting soliloquy on the nature of interesting article on the nature of soliloquies, and this soliloquy itself is kind of like a short one that the king has here just before we go, and it really emphasizes the king's villainy as if the previous one hadn't. Just for a kind of quick reference as well, on the sheet that I gave you, I've included the still from the Tennant version, from that BBC production, where they choose to have Claudius with the same cracked mirror that they show Hamlet with in Act 3, Scene 4, directly after he's killed Polonius. Now, whether this is a conscious effort to link Claudius and Hamlet, perhaps this builds on those ideas, the Freudian readings of Hamlet's almost merging with Claudius as a kind of figure, that they are basically the same person deep down. I don't know. Maybe. It's an interesting visual decision, obviously not something you can hugely talk about, but I think it just raises some interesting points that we might want to make here about the relationship between these two characters, what they share in common, what they do differently, that kind of stuff. It's interesting as well that the king's face is kind of half obscured, perhaps to kind of, reflect on the nature of his kind of clandestine criminal actions. It's just an interesting point I thought I'd make there. It's just quite strikingly similar to the one previously. Okay, so the actual piece itself is interesting. It's almost like an address to England, the King of England, obviously here. He's not just asking the country to do anything. This is obviously like all times when, like Norway before, like Denmark before, the capitalized addressed country here is like this. Is just is an evocation to the monarch. It says, "If my love thou holdst at aught, and if my great power thereof may give thee sense, since yet thy cicatrice looks raw and red after the Danish sword, and the free oar pays homage to us." Now, this is a kind of a tricky one here. Realistically, there's no like historical background to this. The cicatrice mentioned here is a kind of a previous scar or wound. The implication is that the Danish have previously defeated the English at some kind of battle or something, and as such they owe them some maybe kind of reparation debt or whatever it is, or some kind of some kind of favor in order to kind of call off whatever action had happened there previously. We don't know anything about this. It's never talked about again, other than that it's a convenient setup to get Hamlet out of the country to somebody who needs to do the king a favor. So he's like, look, if you are taking us seriously and that you know that you owe us something, then our sovereign process, which imparts at full by letters congruing to that effect the present death of Hamlet, is like, you will basically get Hamlet killed. My request, my royal request, is that you kill off Hamlet. Now, that is quite a statement to make, I would argue. And this is quite a nice reveal for the audience. We know that there's something suspicious. Hamlet is already slightly suspicious about being taken away to England. He talks to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Well, talks to his mother about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as what did he describe them as? Two adders with vipers, basically snakes, poison snakes. He describes them as. So he is already suspicious about this, but this is the reveal that his trip to England is going to be fatal for him. Do it, England, for the hectic in my blood. So that idea of sickness coming back again, that's the third or fourth time in this section of scenes, 4:1 to 4:3, that the king has referred to Hamlet and his madness and his behaviour as a poison or a disease or an illness in Denmark. And in this time it's in king's blood. So this idea, as I said earlier, that linking of the body, the physical body of the king with the safety and health of the state is again coming up again. So that's grand. And he says, thou must cure me. So this is kind of, again, that personal relationship between him and England. Till I know 'tis done, however, mayhaps my joys will never begun. So he's basically look, until this happens, until Hamlet is dead, I cannot enjoy my life. No matter what my fortunes and circumstances are, I will be unable to rest. I will be anxious and I will be uncertain. Okay, so a nice bit again here. All kinds of issues of power again coming up. here in terms of that kind of as a theme. And the scheming aspect of the king here particularly prominent. Okay, the king's kind of like manipulative, Machiavellian schemings being made very open to us an audience. They were kind of shown earlier in the scene in terms of his interactions with the courtiers, but here it's like he is really put together a kind of dastardly scheme. Again, thinking about how it represents kind of Claudius as a figure. Again, the Machiavelli stuff. He doesn't want to damage Hamlet. He doesn't want to send him away and kind of wound him. He wants to crush him. He wants to get rid of Hamlet entirely. Okay, he wants him gone. So this is a particularly good scene to have a look at that. And then we kind of shift it up for a bit. That's kind of the first three scenes. Obviously, they kind of form a kind of coherent whole. They are essentially telling the story of Hamlet and his treatment of Polonius's body up until, they find it realistically and he's sent away. If you have any questions on this, obviously, send them over to me right now. I will give a quick pause and then we will move on. Obviously, make sure you're taking notes throughout this. I will be sending out as well. I wanted to kind of do that after the session, but I will be sending out a prezi on this couple of scenes as well. But I thought it would be useful if I went through this first, because it gives us some good ideas as to what we can be talking about with those opening scenes. If we don't have any questions, though, I am happy to move straight onwards to the next section, which will be looking at the kind of first proper appearance, so to speak, of Fortinbras on stage, albeit quite a short one. He does turn up here. Okay, so let's flip over to that. So here we go. Fortinbras is on stage. And he's like, look, let's do some stuff. So he asks his captain. Now, this scene, actually, in terms of its setting, is a kind of an odd setting. It's often essentially set in some kind of field somewhere in Denmark or nearby, where Hamlet is being led to the boats that will take him to England. And Fortinbras is coming through with his army. As it says, Fortinbras and a captain with his army over the stage. So you have a couple of actors or whatever above the stage, where usually there'd be a slot for them to kind of stand. Or if obviously there's no slot for that, then they'd use the back of the stage usually. And we have Fortinbras talking to his captain. Go from me to greet the Danish king. Tell him that by his license, Fortinbras craves the conveyance of a promised march over his kingdom. So he already made the deal with the king that he would not attack Denmark, and instead is off to attack somewhere else instead. Here he is just making sure that he's doing that. Fortinbras following all the rules that he said he would do. He says, the rendezvous is that if His Majesty would aught with me, we shall express our duty in his eye and let him know so. So he's like, look, I want to be very by the book here. We're going to get stuff done. I'm going to do this clearly. So, captain's off to do that. Fortinbras says, all right then, on you go. I'm off to go and have my fight. And the captain is the only character left on stage, at which point Rosencrantz Guildenstern, taking Hamlet, we assume, come on stage, and they meet the captain. So this is a kind of moment where Hamlet almost meets Fortinbras. They kind of just narrowly cross, and the captain is the kind of middle ground. Hamlet's like, whose army is this? This is a lot of guys. What are they doing? And the captain's like, they're of Norway. So he's like, what are you doing? What purpose? This is a big army. What are they going to do? They're not going out for dinner. And the captain's like, okay, yeah, they're going against some part of Poland. There's almost this kind of like dismissive comment. There's some part of, just going a little bit of Poland. Like, it's not particularly like, the most, outstanding part of the country. He says that, who commands them? This is an army. The nephew to old Norway, Fortinbras. So it was like, okay, this captain is Captain Exposition, essentially. He's just here to tell Hamlet stuff. And he's like, okay, goes him against the main of Poland, or for some frontier. It says, like, are you attacking, Poland, or are you attacking the kind of outskirts of Poland, the edges, to take a kind of little bit off the side? And the captain is like, look, truly, to be honest, with no addition, I'm not dressing this up. To be honest, I'm not making up a little bit much here. And he's like, look, we're really just going in to gain a little patch of ground that hath in it no profit but the name itself. To pay 5 ducats, 5, I would not farm it. She's like, look, we're getting basically nothing out of this. Yeah. He's like, we're just getting the name of having it in our eyes. We're not getting any kind of like additional kind of worth for it. He says, nor will it yield to Norway or the Pole a ranker rate should it be sold in fee. So he's like, this is basically nothing much at all here. I wouldn't bother with it realistically, So he's like, so why then would the Pole would never defend it? He's like, this is, if this land is worth so little, the Polak, which is a term that we've used previously, smote the Polak on the ice. Polacks on the ice. This is just a term that they use to refer to Polish people in the play. He's like, they won't defend it if it's such a useless bit of ground. And the captain's like, yeah, but it was already garrisoned. It's got forces on it already. It's occupied by an army. So Hamlet is essentially like, wow, this is quite a lot. So he says 20,000 souls and 20,000 ducats will not debate the question of this straw. This is the imposture of much wealth and peace that inward breaks and shows no cause without why the man dies. I humbly thank you, sir. So Hamlet gives these lines essentially making up the numbers, obviously. But he's essentially going over this sense of like the fact that these characters, realistically are going to decide this huge amount of money and people and whatever it is, going straight to war over basically nothing, which is an interesting kind of lines. And the captain's like, fine, well, I got to go. He leaves on, and then Hamlet essentially goes, I will follow, I'll see you later. So yeah, so Rosencrantz is essentially going like, bye captain, see you later, I'm going to go off and we'll get you on the boat now. And Hamlet's like, give me a second, I'll come along, but I've got to have a quick kind of moment to catch up with myself. Now this is obviously the setup for his last soliloquy of the play. I've given you these quotes already this week, so as a reminder, these were quotes that essentially are there to maybe make us challenge and think about this last soliloquy. I'm not saying it's necessarily a balanced soliloquy, but as you're reading it, guys, I want you to be starting in the chat to start sending over some questions and your thoughts on this soliloquy, because I think it's a particularly interesting one. So Hamlet sees this army, and he's seen this, and he's kind of made these comments, hasn't he, all about the nature of this this battle, that it's a particularly kind of grand event for very little for little gain. And he sees this army going, and he kind of thinks to himself, hang on a minute, like the actors before him, they are all doing this for basically nothing, seemingly honor and glory more than anything else. And he has a soliloquy that reflects upon that. It's very reminiscent of his soliloquy, "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I," which follows on directly from the speech by the first player from the Aeneid, where he kind of goes, "Hang on a minute, this guy can cry all this stuff. Why can't I do it?" And this speech is a little bit of much of the same, I suppose. Let's go through it. So, how all occasions do inform against me. So this is like, how all events, things that happen to me, basically inform against me. I basically go like, oops, knocked the book a bit there. He's basically going like, look, everything is kind of showing me up. Yeah, everything is, going against me as such in terms of kind of a mental standpoint. He says, and spurs my dull revenge. So he's like, look, everything is just basically going like, what are you doing? You need to sort yourself out, get this done. what is a man if his chief good and market of his time is but to sleep and feed? He's like, what am I if I'm just hanging around sleeping and eating? I am a beast, no more. Sure, he made us of that large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. So it's like, people need to do things, yeah? And this is a link back to his previous statements in Act 2, Scene 2 on the nature of humanity. His kind of big humanist, I've left the AO3 up there, but there you go. It fits his big humanist kind of points about, people have great capabilities. They shouldn't just be sitting around doing nothing, eating and sleeping, which perhaps interesting comments at this time at this time period, while we are all sat indoors, most likely. That's what they say with Easter holidays, sleeping and eating. Hopefully we're all back doing some good work now. And he's just like, we weren't made for this. And he's kind of, I suppose, putting himself in that position. He is kind of maybe making himself a beast here. Now, whether it be bestial oblivion or some scrupled craven is to be cowardly, scruple of thinking too precisely on the event. So again, this idea of overthinking stuff comes back. This is from his Act 3, Scene 1 soliloquy. This idea of overthinking it. A thought of which quartered hath but one part wisdom and ever 3 parts coward. So he's going over that again. This idea of thinking makes people cowards. Well, Hamlet is a thinker. That's his whole deal, and he hates himself for it, seemingly. I do not know yet why I live to say this things to do, sith I have cause, will, and strength and means to do it. So he's like, why am I still saying, I've got to do this later on, even though I have the will and strength and means to do it? It's like, why have I, not, I don't know, washed my clothes when I have the dirty clothes, a washing machine, washing liquid, and power and electricity and water? Why have I not done it? Why do I still wait to do this? I could do this. I could go out and kill the king at any point. I was literally stood behind him with a sword. Why didn't I do it? I was like, well, actually, because I'm a big coward who overthinks things. And he says, examples gross as earth exhort me, witness this array of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince. So this is quite an interesting. He is here like, look, right now I'm being shown. Yeah? Right now I am being shown this kind of like example of someone who is, is showing him up, essentially. He's like, Fortinbras is doing this. You look at this huge army being led by a delicate and tender prince. Now that is an interesting line here. Perhaps I would realistically argue that this section is specifically a line to set up the idea of Fortinbras as a noble figure, a nobility character. He gives him the kind of similar status to himself, Hamlet perhaps, this delicate and tenderness, this thoughtfulness, this feeling that he himself has, because Fortinbras, we hopefully know, is going to be the figure left in power at the end of this play. So although we haven't spent much stage time with Fortinbras, I don't think this is a line that is there to set up Fortinbras as a legitimate character. This is like, hey, look, Fortinbras needs to be taken seriously. He's a good guy. Look at his kind of things. Whose spirit with divine ambition puffed makes mouths at the invisible event. Basically faces down death, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare even for an eggshell. So, look, this guy is crazy. He's he got divine ambition. He is like godlike almost in his ambition. He is just showing down death. He's like, look, I will take you on. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to risk my life. I'm going to risk my fortune for basically nothing, but because he's got this great powerful will. And Hamlet admires, we know Hamlet admires this because he's talked so much about how he admires his father at the start of the play, and he's like, this is great. Rightly to be great is not to start without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw where honour's at the stake. So he's like, look, he knows that honour and fighting for honour is the key thing in life. That is why Fortinbras is doing this, because there's honour at stake. And then Hamlet's like, look, how am I here? How stand I that I have a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep. So it's like, what am I doing? Fortinbras is doing all of this. he's doing all these things, and I've sat here with an actual real issue of honor. Fortinbras' honor is debatably at stake here. But Hamlet's like, I've got this real issue of honor. My dad is been killed. Yeah. He's been murdered. My mother has been stained. So this is Hamlet kind of going back on his, you can go back to your content on that there. The eventing, Janet Adam and stuff. Hamlet's fixated again. And this goes always the structure, isn't it? Whenever Hamlet comes back to his uncle, it's always murderer, incestuous. So that's back. It's like I've got all these motivations for why I should be angry, and yet I'm doing nothing about it. Yeah, he's like the imminent death of 20. Again, this number of 20,000 men. I have no idea where Hamlet's getting this from. I don't know if he's counted the entire Polish army, if he's counted all of that Norway's army. God knows. It's 20,000 men that for fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot of land, obviously, doesn't say of land, but that's what it is, whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, i.e. literally the ground is not big enough for the men to be buried in it, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. So like this ground isn't great enough, is not worth anything, and it's not even big enough to fit all their bodies in it who will die here. So from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. Again, almost a callback to previous points of the play, where Hamlet is like, look, I need to do this, or I'm basically useless. So what I like to do, guys, is to quickly send me over your interpretations of this scene. I've talked already about this as why perhaps these two figures, Edwards and Hibbard, describe this soliloquy as insufficient, do nothing to advance or reveal anything new about Hamlet's state of mind. So I want you to send over some ideas as to what you have here on this section, please. And I will answer them, and then we will finish up. Give you a couple of seconds. Obviously check over anything else as well. I'm just going to be waiting here like a chump. I'll cut this out at the end there. All right, I will look forward to seeing your responses to this on your work at the end of the week on Friday. All right, that is that. We will wrap up there. Yeah, fine. I will see you all next week. So as a quick heads up for next week, we will be doing Act 4, obviously, unsurprisingly, scenes 5 through 7. So those scenes are the scenes that cover two things, mostly Ophelia's madness, downfall, and death. There's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about there. Laertes' return to Denmark, and Hamlet's return to Denmark as well. So those are the main things that we're going to cover next week. Then that leaves us with just 2 scenes to go. So we're nearly there. So the week after next, we will do... basically, let's fill out the rest of this term. 2 weeks from now, we will do Act 5, Scene 1, the graveyard scene. And then 3 weeks from now, we will do Act 5, Scene 2, the final scene of the play. And then that's pretty much that. For Hamlet, we'll do a lesson after that on that. In the meantime, I'll be setting you another essay. And then, we'll be prepping over and revising both Hamlet and the Duchess of Malfi. So, pretty good. All right, guys. Take it easy. I will see you soon. Yeah, all right. They just don't send correct. They don't respond